Welcome, everyone. Hope you're having a good virtual Philly Code Camp, our first one of its kind. Today, we're going to be, for the next hour or so under an hour, we'll be taking a look at what I refer to as state of mind, understanding state management in modern web applications. The slide deck and the code for all this stuff is at my GitHub repository there. I'll have that link later on, too, and I'm sure we're saving the file somewhere for you guys. All right. So our agenda for today is first to take a look at what is state management. Why do we need it? When do we need it? Just kind of giving kind of the background of like why are we going to invest time in understanding state management and the different frameworks and stuff. And then we'll be heavily focusing on the njrx framework, which is a framework for Angular to do the Redux pattern and state management. And as we go through the different slides and code examples, we'll be taking a look at some of the basics of Angular and RxJS, which is a key cornerstone of how njrx works. We'll dive into a bit the design patterns and overview of what all those things are, because it's very important to understand like how everything works. We'll take a look at some tooling that's very critical. There's a nice Chrome plugin that makes our lives much easier. And then we'll dive into all the different components of njrx. What are models? What are reducers? What are selectors, actions? And then we'll wrap it up, take a look at effects and services, and then some lessons learned that I've came across having built some applications with njrx. If you do have questions, I think you can raise your hand. I think the moderator will let me know. But definitely, if we can keep moving forward, that would be good too. All right. Why do we need state management? In a nutshell, building modern applications, particularly web applications, are hard. And the main reason why they've gotten a lot harder is people have high expectations of what their user experience is going to be. We're not building very simple CRUD type applications anymore or forms over type data applications. People were expecting rich experiences. So I'm sure we've all been to Amazon at one point in time. And I think this is always a kind of a good example of an application to show what do we mean by state management. So we talk about state management, we talk about a lot of different things. There's a lot of stuff in this application. First, who is the current logged in user, right? When you logged in, you may have different behaviors or access to different things in an application. We also have the cart. You may have one or more items in the cart. Your cart may be empty, like in this case of the picture. We also have the search results here. I was been desperately looking, I'm sure as most of us, for Xbox Series X devices. So we can see here that we have a number of search results comes up. We also have over here on the left the different filters that I've selected for these things. But also take note here, we have little things like 1 of 16 currently being displayed, 812 results total for Xbox. But then we have this third submenu here that shows you a bunch of different keywords related to your top search word. So if I was to come up here and switch from Xbox to PlayStation, I would have a different set of data that needs to come back to the user. And the intent here is we want to make the user experience super rich, which is obviously the look and feel of the application, but also how responsive it is and how quickly the user can continue to move their applications. So that's why do we need state management? There's lots of state in an application, and in order to give the most robust user experience, state management has become a key component of your application. When do we need state management? The simple answer is always. Even in the most simplistic application, the level of state can become complex and overwhelming. Well, if you've been if any of my talks over the years, or you're familiar with patterns and design principles, you know one of the ways we deal with complexity is finding the right patterns and applying them. So this is a quick little chart I put together. In Angular, there's basically 3 ways we could handle this. There is the RxJS solution, which is a custom type solution. There is njrx, which is what we're going to take a look at today. And then there's a few other libraries floating around. One of them that was gaining some traction is njxs. There's also one called Akita and one called MobX that aren't used too much in the Angular world, but they're like MobX is popular in React. These numbers are pretty arbitrary, just basically my opinion, but I just wanted to kind of give you some high level. There are different solutions and things like that. My general rule of thumb is if it's a fairly simplistic application, njrx may be overkill. So you can always start out with RxJS type of solution. The NJX is actually a little easier to get started with. The problem is it's not very popular, and there's not a whole lot of samples and documentation. By NJRX, it is basically the standard way of doing this. If you're going to do state management with a framework in Angular, it is how you do it. There's a lot of backing, particularly by Google, a number of developers and things that are heavily involved in that library. It's open source. All these are open source. So that's kind of the when do you need the state management and sort of the different options you have. And like I said, we're going to be taking a look at today njrx heavily and diving into that. Before we do that, though, one of the important things to understand is if you've been working with Angular for a while, you may not even realize this, that most of Angular is built around using RxJS, which is a library, separate library, but it's built into Angular that allows you to interact and work with things called streams. So in JavaScript, we have promises, right? I want to make an AJAX call, and I have a promise I can use, and then it will return me a result. The major difference between a promise and a stream, an RxJS stream, is a promise happens once. Once it's come back, it's done. It's never going to happen again. You'd have to recreate it from scratch. Where a stream, the idea here is I can have a subject and I can have subscribers. So every time the subject changes or something happens to the subject, my subscribers can get notified. You can look at it as a pub sub model if you're familiar with that pattern. So in RxJS, I'm bringing this up now because as we look through all the samples for njrx, we're going to see a lot of these things used. And under the covers, a lot of what makes njrx work and powerful is the fact that they are using observables and different operations and things. So RxJS, there are two key things you need to know. First of all, there are observables. So these are they're subjects and subscribers. So if you were going to roll your own state management, what I've done in the past is I've used something called a behavior subject. It's just a simple type object where you would store different state data in there, and you could have subscribers be able to be notified when you change something. When you use something like njrx, all that's abstracted away from you. You don't need to deal with your subscribers and subjects and stuff. It's all much more integrated for you and gives you a much more robust experience. The other part of RxJS you need to deal with are operators. So operators are basically different functions and things that you will do as you go along. One of the ones that you'll come across quite a bit is a pipe. And actually, having worked now with njrx for a few months, I've actually realized pipes are actually part of JavaScript. I actually thought it was part of RxJS, but it's actually its own piece. And a pipe, if you're not familiar, it basically is an operator that says, I want to execute these series of different functions or operations, and I want to return the result for the first one into the second one, into the third one, et cetera, et cetera. From and of are very important. You'll make heavy use of those. Those are operators that will take either an array or some other type of non-stream-based piece, so like a promise or something, and they will convert those into a observable stream. Map and exhaust map are also heavily used. Those are basically different operators where you say, I want to take this action, I want to iterate over it in different ways. And then filters are pretty common too. If you're familiar with link expressions and things, you can think of a filter as like a select statement. I want to select 10 objects from this array based on which ones have where the customer is located in New York City, for example. So as we go through all these samples, I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging into, well, this is using a pipe and this is using a map and stuff, but you will see all these being used in njrx. So it's important to have that terminology understood. All right, so the first thing we're going to take a look at is diving into the design patterns and the overview of what njrx is. And then we will dive heavily into some coding examples and breaking this all down. But one of the big push behind state management the last few years has been this idea that it's gotten too complex. If you have just simple data binding or two-way data binding, it's added a layer of complexity that makes applications really hard to maintain, really hard to render and deal with. So we've come up with this idea of, it came out of the React world, called the single flow or the Redux pattern. So njrx is built on that pattern, and these are all the different type of components and things you might be using inside of an njrx application. The first thing down here in purple is our store. So you can think of the store as the state of the application, like we were talking about when we were diving into the Amazon search result page. Everything about your application, from the search results to the current logged in user to the fact that a button is currently hovered, all that is state, and all that state should be in a single place, a single truth, which is the store. You then have selectors, which represent the different pieces of the store you want your UI to interact with. I kind of typically refer to those as view models, if you're familiar with the MVM pattern. And we'll dive into all these things with some code examples and stuff. Components, everyone who's ever worked with Angular or React, they should know what components are. Basically, they are some UI element. So a component will render out the results from the selector. And then where we start diving into the Redux pattern and njrx is when you component needs to do something, like I want to click and get a search results, or I want to filter data on the screen, or whatever. In the past, you'd have a click button, and you click the button, and then you'd go off and get the data yourself. When you're using the Redux pattern in RJRX, instead of calling the service directly, what you will do is invoke an action. And actions you can think of are basically the start of your process. When an action is complete, the store will be updated, and the component will render the new piece. Because you see here with these arrows, it's a single flow. The component never deals with the actual store itself. It always triggers an action, which does something. So on the left-hand side here, we can see we have an action that can be fired off that calls a reducer. And a reducer is a key component of the njrx world. What this job and his responsibility is take any data that he receives and update the store. And it's very important that only reducers update stores, right? So your component should never interact with the store. It should never change data in the store. It would trigger an action that would update reducer, would call a reducer or trigger a reducer, and that will update the store. We also have cases where we really want to make so that we simplify complexity. So the idea here is every time you trigger an action, a reducer gets triggered, and it changes the data in the store. The idea here behind it is you trying to make these things as what we refer to as pure functions. So every time I call an action, the reducer gets triggered. The same expected result happens. But sometimes you need to go off and get new data or something else, which you can't guarantee is going to have the exact same result. So for example, if you want to go to a search results on the server, the action itself doesn't call the service and perform the action to call the server. It does it calls off to the things called effects, or actually what it does is the action triggers the effect, and the effect will go off and handle the service, and then that will return data, which triggers another action. And we will dive into all these things in a piece. This is sort of just the high level 5,000-foot view of the solution. So as we dive in more, we will take a look at actions. We'll take a look at reducers, the store, obviously, selectors, and then a little bit later on, we'll take a look at effects and services. But these are very important as we go through the examples. Single flow, component calls action, action triggers reducer, call state. One of the nice things about working with Redux and njrx is there is a lot of tooling that's been available for us that makes our lives a whole lot easier. We will be diving into how this tooling works. It is almost critical. If you don't, you need to have this tool, the Redux developer tool, installed in Chrome in order to be able to really work with Redux and understand what's going on. All right, off to the different pieces. So njrx. There are a couple of things you need to understand. First of all, when you create your Angular application, it's not part of the Angular default installation. You are some setup and installation you need to do. And there's two pieces. There's a store. You'll have to install the store npm module. There's a devtools piece that you would need to install if you want to work with the Redux plugin. And then later on, when we looked at effects themselves is also a separate installation. So once you do the installation, we then are going to take a look at the store itself. Take a look at the store. What is a store? Store is made up of models, and we have initial state. We'll take a look at building a basic reducer, build a selector to get initial state, create some actions, pass data to the actions, kind of move on to those things. So basically, we're focusing on the left-hand side of this little window over here. So let's dive into some code. It wouldn't be code camp if we didn't have code. So let me just open a new terminal window. I'm not going to reinstall them, but I will show you the command lines you need to have. Let's see. All right. So here is the command to install the njrx store. If you're familiar with npm, it's a straightforward npm call, install, and then the npm package name. The devtools is the next one down. You can see here store devtools. And in both those cases, they will install the components and things you need for working with njrx and working with the store. So once you install those, the next thing you'll need to do is, and we'll take a look at a few things in a second, but because we're in here now, in your app module, you're going to add this little command and import here called store module for root, and you're going to pass in the structure of your data. So you have the name of your object, so what's in your store. So in this case, it's called basic context. And then you're going to pass in the reducer, which is basically what's in charge of initializing the store and handling all the different data that comes in. Next up is the instrumentation piece. So this is how our DevTools work for Redux. And we'll dive a little more in that in a second. But the important thing here is you need to set it up, and you have a max age, and you also have the logout. All right. And then we'll take a look at effects a little later. So that's the only initialization part. So you install it, you set up the store in your app module. So the very first thing you need to do when you work with a store is come up with a model. And it's very common when you work with njrx or Redux, you will model your model after domain-driven design principles. So you'll see a lot of places I have the word context. That's just a common thing we use in the DDD world. So all our examples are very straightforward. They were designed to be quick, easy to understand, not complex real world type examples. So you'll see first, we're going to export this interface called basic context, and we're going to have a couple properties here. So count and test. In most of the examples I've seen in working with njrx, a lot of times you use interfaces. It's just a standard thing. If you're familiar with TypeScript, it's just the recommended practices because it just keeps things simpler. And next up, we have we're taking our basic context here. We're going to create a constant from it called initial basic state. And we're going to stick in the two values, so count and test. Now that we have a model, the next thing we need to do is create our reducer. So this is what a very simple reducer looks like. We have references to our store. We can see a reference to our model. And then we'll also take a look at the action in a second. So you create a const, and you can see const used quite a bit because basically these things exist for the lifetime of your application. So we're creating a reducer called a basic reducer. We're going to pass it our initial basic state, which is what we created over here. So we'll have count, 1, and test init data. We'll come back to this in a second or two. We'll dive back in a second, but we have any actions that can trigger the change in the reducer. Those are there. We then export out the reducer as a function. And you can see here it says basic reducer. We jump back real quick to our app module. You see here, that's where it's being used, where it's being wired up. All right, so that's what the reducer looks like. So this take real quick. Oops, wrong thing. Let's just run our little application here. So this is the output of what we've just seen. We see init data, we see count from store. I'm going to fire up the little Redux little guy. So when you install this guy, normally you're right, everyone should be familiar with Elements console source. You'll also have this new thing added. It's a plugin for Chrome. So when you install it in the Chrome, it'll pop over here. What's really nice is it lets you see the current state of your application. So here you can see our count 1, test. If we jump real quick back to our application, and we fire this update method, we're going to see the data up here was updated. If we jump back over here, we're going to see now on the left here, these are all the different operations that's happened. So there's initialization of the store, initialization of the effect, And now we see this thing called basic action was fired. So if I click on that, I can see the data changed. So see init data, update via simple action. I could actually see what action was triggered, if there's any data passed. There's some different operations in here. As our model gets more complex, some of these charts are kind of interesting how they're used. But for right now, we're going to focus on the tree. So it's critical to understand how this dev tool works. It makes your life much easier to work with njrx. So we have a count, we have a test, and again, the important thing here is we can see the different operations. Now, if we jump real quick back to our code, jump back down here in app module again one more time, we can see down here when we set up our dev tools, we said the max age was 25. That corresponds to how many different things will appear in the Chrome tools. So here, there'll be 25 of these listed. So that's how that gets wired up. All right, so let's keep going. So that's our basic example. So we have reducer. We define our reducer. We create actions. So here's the action we triggered in that example. So the basic action. Just a little helpful tidbit. These names here, even though they're a string, they need to be unique too. Ran into some cases where I didn't make those unique and ran some problems. So typically what I do is that's just used for internal purposes, is whatever I call this here, I'll also call it there. And then in the dev tools, you'll see it actually appears as the text in there, which is helpful. All right, so the next thing we're going to take a look at is our selectors. So a couple important things. Remember, we created something called basic context. So when you create your selector, it's very important to keep things referencing as the same name. So it's common nomenclature to call it basic context everywhere you go. So we're going to create our learn context because we're learning about njrx. We're going to create a little pipe here that takes the context from here, creates into a variable. We pass it into a selector. And then we tell our selector, what do we want to select out? So here we have two different selectors. One, we want to select out the test, which is a string, or we want to select the one that's count. Righty, head over here. So now we have our selector. Let's take a look at our components. So this is a very simple component. Nothing a lot going on here. You can see here we do make a reference to our store. We have to reference our actions. And we also reference our selectors. So a couple important things. First of all, every component will need to select in the store to interact with it. And typically what you do is you have selectors. So here we want to get test, get count. And from there, we want to stick those into something. So because these are observables coming back from the NJX store, we're going to create two observables, a string and a number. It is, again, naming convention, always use $sign. So whenever you see a $sign, it represents it is some kind of observable. We'll take a look at the action in a second. So now we have all this wired up. This actually sets up a one-way stream that every time something happens to the store, these guys get notified. So if you ever work with njrx and you had to set up your own subscribers and subscribe to things, this is basically under the covers doing the same thing. Now we dive a little further. We can see here in our UI, we're now binding two different span tags. So we bind it to the observables. And again, naming conventions, you want to make these async. That ensures that every time the value changes, the new value gets popped into the UI. This is our click button where we trigger off that action. So we come down here. You see here we have a store, and we're going to dispatch that action. And I will jump over to our little sample here. So initially, init data 1, we'd update. We've now updated the data. And all the code we had to write was basically the reducer, the model set up for the store, and all the pieces that make all the rest happen is triggered through actions and selectors. All right, are any questions so far before we dive in further? Okay, let's keep going.
Yeah, I don't see any hands raised.
Yeah, I couldn't see the team thing. I want to make sure to take a break.
Yep.
All right, let's keep moving forward then. All right, so the second example we're going to take a look at here. So that's sort of like the basic hello world, get you everything going, get you familiar with the different things. Again, the important things are you're going to have observables, you're going to work with selectors, you're going to interact with the store to get selectors, and then you're going to call actions. So we close all these guys. And now we're going to take a look at our more advanced sample here. This time, we're going to run this first of all. But before I do that, I have to go back here and flip this back. And I'll explain how we work when you have more than one reducer and stuff in a minute. Just want to refresh the screen. Make sure our code all compiled. Sure it, yep, looks like it's good. All right, so that was the basic example. Now we're going to take a look at interacting with actions and different things. All right, so our UI is going to demonstrate what this UI does first before we dig into code. We have account again from the store. We could add to the account. We can subtract the account. We can reset the account, or we can type a value in and then specifically set the value of that face. So again, this is kind of there you go. String concatenation works great. Let's reset there. So we can again add, subtract, or you can specifically set the value. So how does that work? So the first thing is when you have more than one reducer, you can't just pass in one piece. You have to pass them in separately. So if we jump up to our reducer map, we can see here we just created a constant with all the different reducers, and just referencing the 3 different reducers. So the basic reducer we just referenced, the one we're going to reference now called component, and the one for the effects we're going to look at in a little bit called learn. Yes, again, taking a look at all that. Sorry, jumping around a little bit. So this is how you would construct your structure of if you have more than one reducer, which is very common in an application. You could have lots of different reducers. So that's how we dive on that. So now let's take a look at our new set of reducers here. So again, we're going to have a model. This time it's called the component context model. We're going to give an initial state. We're just going to have the count in here this time. And then we're going to jump into our reducer, and we see a little more is happening in here. So again, same structure, create your reducer, return it as an export. But we're going to see a couple different things happening now. So the main purpose of this reducer is to take the initial state of the account and then handle all the different operations when you're doing things. So here we have add an action, sub action, reset action, and it's pretty common in the reducers and recommend it. You try to keep your reducers straightforward and simplistic. So you take advantage of the spread operator in JavaScript, and then we say, here's the current state. We want to take the count property, and we want to add 1, we want to subtract 1, or we want to reset the 0, or we want to, whatever gets passed in, basically pass it in. So those are our different actions and how the reducers work with them. We now have a few more actions here. Again, because the actions don't need to pass data, they can just trigger the reducer to add and subtract. We have the add action, sub action, and reset action. There are cases, though, where you do want to pass values from your component or something else. And in those cases, when you create your action, you also create something called a props. And this is just a basically anonymous class you create here, passing in all your values. In this case, I'm just going to pass in any and payload. It's very common if you look at any examples for njrx, they always use the word payload. And the idea here is whatever I pass in the reducer itself, go through and take that value and basically update the count. All right, so that's that. And then real quick, selectors again. At this point, it should be kind of what you expect to happen here. We're grabbing our context and we're returning the count property. Over here in our component, same thing. We have an observable for our count data. We have the current value we use when we want to grid the value. We accept our store in. We set up our observable to count data, call our different actions. And now when we want to call the action that passes a value, we basically just create something, we just paste that class definition in based on the action definition, and that's it. That is all the pieces you need to do to understand how to do the basic stuff with njrx. So again, your setup and actions. We have the store module. The store has a models and initial state. We are building a basic reducer. So how do we work with reducers? We went over that. Talked a little bit about building selectors and how we get the initial state. We take a look at actions, and then we take a look at passing data to actions. So if you had a very simple application and you're using njrx, that's pretty much all you need to know. There's nothing extra you need to understand. And again, the important idea here, what we're trying to focus on, is we want a single flow of data. Every time a component changes, we want to pop that into the store via the reducer and keep the entire state of the application in a single place. In this case, the store, njrx store. All right. So real world applications very rarely have cases where all the data is come in the beginning and nothing ever changes. It's very common, as we were looking at the Amazon example, that users will click and interact with different UI elements, and based on those things they select, different data needs to come back. And the way we tackle that is we trigger these things called effects, which invoke Angular services and go off and get data and do those normal things. So the important thing here in our little picture over here is every time an effect needs to get triggered, you call an action, which triggers the effect, and the end result of that effect action, end result of the effect is triggering another action, which then would trigger, most likely update the store via the reducer. It is common to chain effects together and do different things. So effects they can be asynchronous or synchronous, so they will trigger data back and forth, and typically you'd work with a server. But what if you store data in local storage? In the same case, you actually would never work with local storage. It would call an effect that would read the value from local storage or whatever it needs to be. You want to grab the picture from the person's webcam. Again, you'd call an effect to go capture the picture from the webcam. So there is a different setup and installation for effects. The main purpose of effects is to isolate the side effect from components, allowing for more pure components, the select state and dispatch action. Again, you're trying to keep the UI simplified so the effects are responsible for doing anything that may or may not be predictable. Particularly things like long-running services. You may have cases where you need to do 5 or 6 things before a result needs to get updated in the UI or something. Or so they could be long-running services. They could also effects filtered those actions based on types of actions that are interested in. So that's a bit wordy, but what that basically means is it'll be very typical for your application to have several different effects. You could have dozens if possible, and they will only fire when the action that triggers that effect is called. One important thing, in case I forget it later, effects do have overhead. They are initialized in the beginning and they exist the entire lifetime of the application. They basically are, the way to look at effects in Angular terms is their services. So they exist forever. So you don't necessarily create hundreds of them, but you do want to make sure anything that you need to do outside of the normal flow of things are done through effects. They can be synchronous or asynchronous, and they always return a new action. So let's dive a little more. The code for effects. So like the same thing we did with our producer, since we have multiple producers, we also have multiple effects. Difference is this time the effect setup is actually an array and not an object we're passing in. So there's an array of different effects. We come down to our module, and there's, like I said, there's a separate installation for that. So the effect module, we pass in that map. Let's dive down real quick. There you go. There is the npm install for njrx effects. So again, the idea here is simple applications, you don't need effects, don't install that component. most applications, most real world applications, you will have effects. So you have to deal with them. Okay. So let's take a look at a few things here. We have all that good stuff. All right, so I'm going to do this a little backwards this time. So we're going to take a look at our component first. So we're going to see our component this time has a table. So we're going to do a search result, and we're going to take a list of customers, and then we're going to iterate over them and just stick them into a table. We're also going to have this thing below here where we can go off and we can filter the data and stuff like that. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Down here in our component, we'll see here we have our effects component this time, and it has a couple different observables. So we have our little test data we use. We have our list of customers. So here, the observable this time is an array of customers. We also have the selected customer, which is how the little filter will work. And again, we'll accept in the store. We'd have different selectors come through. When we want to load data, because we're not passing anything to the effect, we can just call the action. But then when we do want to filter data, we actually going to trigger a couple different effects here. So one is set the filter ID, and then we'll filter data. We'll take a look at that in a second. Just going to focus on the first effect first, and then we'll dive into the second one. So let's dive into our UI again. So this time we're going to take a look at the learn example. And we can see here we have load customer. It's going to go off and call a service that's sitting behind here. It has a bunch of customers come back. We can also then filter things like that. Data. Again, we can load that thing. Load customers. So that's what the UI is doing, just to give you some idea as we take a look at things. All right. So initially, we're going to focus on the first part here. So this load data operation action. So again, we have our very basic model, but this time you can see the model has been enhanced a little bit. So our learn context has our count and test. For the other things we're using, we have a list of customers, we have the filter ID, and we have the selected customer. So this is a more of a real world type example of what you'd expect to have in state. Whoever the selected customer is something you need to be able to work with. Again, we initialize the state, so we have different things. So a couple important things here. Always give valid values. If you give nulls, a lot of times the selectors won't like those. So it's very important to give non-null type initialized values. So let's take a look at that. Again, our selectors, we can see here, we're going to do the normal ones we've been doing, test customer. We also see we have the selected customer come back. So again, that's pretty straightforward by now. Same thing with the actions. So we have call learn effect, handle learn success, and learn error. We'll take a look at how those work in a second. But the first thing we're going to take a look at is this call learn effect. So real quick, our reducers, same thing. It's a reducer. It's going to handle some different operations to come back, and we'll dive into how that works in a minute. Jump back to our action. So actually jump back to our component. So we want to load data. We're going to call the learn effect, and that's going to trigger off this call learn effect action. So if we look at our reducer, we see our reducer is not subscribing to that operation because it doesn't care. It's not about updating state. It's actually calling something else, which eventually will come back to us. So that's where effects come in. And I will warn you, effects look, the first few times you look at effects, they look kind of complex and they're a bit callback nauseating. You see all these callback methods. That's just the structure of their application. That's how it works. So a couple of different things here. They are services, so they are injectable. You use the create effect operation to create them. You set up a pipe of who is responsible for triggering these things. So these are the actions. So you see, remember we talked a little bit about RXjs at the beginning with pipes and exhaust maps and different things here. So create an effect. It's going to subscribe to the call learn effect action. When that gets triggered, it will call the service. In this case, the service is get customer. When it's done, there's one or two things going to happen. An error can happen. In those cases, we want to trigger another action called handle learn error, which just returns an error. Well, unable to login user is a bad name. Should be called couldn't get customer data. Get customers. If it's successful, we want to return that data. So we have this handle learn success. And we'll dive into how all that works in Reducer in a second. Let's dive into our customer. So our service looks like any other standard service you'd have in an Angular. So we have a method here. We have a little service we're going to call on localhost. We want to get all the customers. We're just going to call the customer method. When we get one, we just pass in the one method here. So one of the nice things I've come across recently, jump back to our terminals. Pretty sure it's in here. Yes. Nope, that's not. There it is. So when you work with a client application, a lot of times you always need data, right? So I came across this nice little mock server called the JSON mock server. So that's what I'm using to get data. And we'll go over this maybe if we have some time, we can dive into how this works. But it's kind of convenient and nice. So that's the actual data source of our application. So here again, we have our demo source. We're going to go off and get the customer, and we're going to return the result set. When this comes back, this will trigger our effect. So get customer, when the result comes back, whatever is there, we're going to map it over, calling into the reducer. The reducer will handle the success. When it does, it's just going to take the current state that comes in, so customers, and update it. So this is probably a good time for any questions. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and that's what I need to wrap up things.
If there's any questions, you guys can unmute or raise your hand. All right. I guess not.
We'll keep moving forward then. All right. I just want to wrap up a few different things to help you guys. So one typical thing you'll need to work with, we have the referred to as the advanced effect application. So a lot of times you need to, when an effect gets triggered, you don't always necessarily want to pass the data in directly. It's actually better to grab it from the store. So there is another RXjs operator called with latest from. So this is how you would grab the store, grab the current value you want to grab out of here. So this little thing called app context, which represents the entire structure of our application. And we want to get the state, and then we want to grab it. So in this case, we want to grab that ID we want to filter by. So this is the filter, customer filter piece. So this is just a way to grab state out of the store and pass it into an effect. All right, let's jump back here. All right, some lessons learned. Very, very, very important. A lot of examples use the pre 8+ njrx style. I think we're on njrx 10. I could be wrong about that version. 8's been around for a little while. But you'll actually see a lot of examples using attribute-based structures. Those are the old style. You can make those work still, but I've actually found them a lot more complex to work with. So you're better off always starting with the create effect, create action, create reducer, create selector. Those are the njrx 8+ examples. You will find lots of examples, and some of the better examples of how to work in njrx use the older style. You'll just have to kind of mentally map them into the new style. So I have a link somewhere. I'll have to dig it up that shows you the different styles and how to map them back and forth. So I always use 8+ syntax. When you are working with njrx or even Redux, always think model first. What I mean by that is think of your application, not about the UI, not the buttons and the colors and things on your application. Think about the model of the application. What are you trying to put in the UI? Customers, orders, those kind of things. And then what kind of behaviors do you need to do? So I always kind of say, think of model first. You can kind of think of working with these patterns as like MVC on steroids. We don't really use the model view controller approach anymore, but we still have the model for model view controller. Try to keep your reducers simple. Avoid updating deep nested objects. There's a couple different strategies to do that, but it's working with this for a little while. I've run into some hurdles where trying to set the third property down 3 layers, it just gets too complex. So you're better off returning the higher level object and just directly updating that object and keeping your reducers as simple as you can be. If you're familiar with Angular, we have different modules. So you can have a top level app module, but you can also have child type modules. So one of the ways to simplify reducers is you actually can set up submodules for your application. So maybe you have a orders section and a customer section and a product section and some other sections. You could actually create those as submodules in Angular. And when you do that, you would use the feature state functionality of njrx, and it actually simplifies a lot of things. So other than the most simple applications, I would highly recommend looking into creating submodules for different parts of your application. That'll make things easier, and then it also helps you reduce the state of the complexity of the reducers. Next thing to keep in mind is if you do have to handle log running operations, I found it's best actually to have the service return a void to the effect, just so you complete the operation. And then later on, when you actually were done with getting that long running operation, you would trigger an action yourself from the service that would then trigger off the next step. Just some best practice I found. There's other examples out there to do different things, but in the experience I've been working with, I found that works pretty well. If you know something is very unpredictable, like I had in a case where I had to check to see if a user was logged in. If they weren't logged in, then trigger a whole set of redirects to go log them in. So you don't always know necessarily if you're coming back and when you're coming back. There are some great examples out there, particularly this one here. This is more what I call a. There you go. Cool. This is not what you want to read day one when you work with njrx, but these guys, these NRWL guys, they make some great examples, and they make heavy use of njrx in the real world. But they've put together this nice little guide of different patterns and things, what you need to do. The only challenge is you're going to see here they're using a lot of the old style syntax and things. So here, these are what I mean by old style. But what's really nice is they dive into different examples, and then they have some nice pictures and things that show you how basically these are some of the basic things, how to do things. But then they get into, well, the different kind of actions. There's command actions, there's document actions, and there's event actions. And it kind of gives you that, we'll call it 200 level of working with njrx and how you can think in patterns and do those real world things. The next link over here is their example, and it's probably one of the best examples I've seen of really a more complete type application. And obviously the last one here is back to my GitHub repository with this example and the slide deck. All right, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I am done with the presentation and code example. Any questions? Did you guys find this helpful? Are you totally asleep? Is it lunchtime? You're recovering from lunch?
Or having lunch.
No, we're having lunch. Any questions at all?
All right, I guess.
All right, well, if you have any questions, you can always reach out through my GitHub repository or message me on Twitter or anything like that. Feel free.